There's no limit to what a man can do or where he can go if he doesn't mind who gets the credit. That quote is on a plaque behind the desk of this guy seen palling around with Clarence Thomas here.
You know, Leonard, since you're the #3 most powerful person in the world.
Right. God help us.
And Donald Trump over here, and with Justice Samuel Alito at the Vatican. You know the important historical events he shaped.
The right-wing Supreme Court gutted Miranda rights this week
in a high-profile case involving religious liberty.
The Second Amendment, climate, and air pollution restrictions.
5 justices ended the right of American women to choose abortion under the Constitution.
You know all of his famous cronies who have benefited from their friendship with him, but you probably don't recognize his face. His name is Leonard Leo, and he lives the mantra from that quote behind his desk, which he probably got, by the way, from the Ronald Reagan Library gift store. By operating in the shadows and avoiding credit, Leonard Leo has become quite possibly the single most powerful private citizen in America, despite the fact that nobody has ever voted for him in any election. We're going to shine a light on just who he is and what he believes. This is the Classroom for More Perfect Union, and today we're talking about how Leonard Leo broke America's courts. Leonard Leo was born in Long Island and raised Catholic. His father died when he was young, and he was brought up in his grandfather's house, an Italian immigrant who had come to the United States at age 14, worked as a tailor for Brooks Brothers, and moved up to become an executive. Leo idolized his grandfather. He has a lifelong passion for well-tailored suits and says his grandfather's story is emblematic of the American dream. Leo's family moved to New Jersey, and we don't know a whole lot else about Leo during his early years. What we do know is that in his high school yearbook, he was shown holding a big wad of cash with the bizarre nickname Moneybags Kid. Remember this, because Leo is going to show up in lots of places you wouldn't expect, like in ultra-religious Forrest Gump holding a ridiculously large amount of cash that he's probably going to do bad things with.
God help us.
Leo went to Cornell University, where he studied American history and wrote his senior thesis on the Exercise Clause, the part in the First Amendment that says the government can't interfere with religious practice. The summer after graduation, he took an internship in Washington, D.C., where he heard a speech given by Reagan's Attorney General Ed Meese to the Federalist Society, a new right-wing legal organization. In this speech, Meese complained that the Supreme Court was full of activist judges that had abandoned the original principles of the Constitution as the fathers intended, as in America as it was in 1791, you know, the good old days.
The Constitution is a document of fixed and legally binding meaning.
This approach was called originalism, and it was a burgeoning field of study in constitutional law. Leo was impressed. He was more than impressed. He was inspired. He returned to Cornell for law school and started a student chapter of the Federalist Society. Their chapter hosted a regional conference where Leo would meet future Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Future Supreme Court Justice is going to become a running theme in this video. The Federalist Society had just one win and one loss. One of their own, Antonin Scalia, had been sworn in by Reagan, but Robert Bork, another early member, had been rejected.
Mr. Byrd?
No.
Mr. Metzenbaum?
No.
Bork was an extremely controversial choice. The ACLU, NAACP, and Democrats in the Senate all spoke out against his nomination.
Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, rogue police could break down citizens' doors in midnight raids, and school children could not be taught about evolution.
Republicans claimed Kennedy's words were hyperbolic, that they were character assassination. But were they? When Bork and Meese and Scalia talk about activist court, what they're really talking about are the changes that were made under Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren from 1953 to 1969. The Warren Court passed unprecedented cases. Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregated America's schools. Loving versus Virginia, which allowed Clarence Thomas to marry his wife. And Griswold v. Connecticut, that allowed married couples to use contraceptives and paved the way for Roe v. Wade. They're also talking about the New Deal order, when the courts expanded the role of federal governments in regulating corporations and creating rights for workers. And yeah, I think those things would have been pretty hard to get by in 1791. You know, the good old days. Leo graduated and moved to DC, where he went to work at the Court of Appeals. The Federalist Society was trying to grow their lawyer division. They had student chapters at nearly 150 universities, but their network off campus was languishing. Leo was brought on to cultivate talent among practicing attorneys and potential donors. That same year, Leo got an opportunity to expand his influence, and one of his close friends became a top pick to replace civil rights era Judge Thurgood Marshall.
I'd like to thank so many of my friends, and especially my good friend Leonard Leo, for such a warm welcome.
Clarence probably thinks he'd be okay in the good old days. Leo took time off from the supposedly nonpartisan Federalist Society to help secure his friend's nomination, which turned into one of the longest confirmation hearings in history after Anita Hill came forward with sexual harassment allegations against Thomas. Just after Thomas took his seat, the Supreme Court argued a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Casey originated in Pennsylvania, where 5 abortion clinics challenged a law that required anyone seeking an abortion to wait 24 hours before getting the procedure. The law also required married women who wanted abortions to get permission from their husbands. Wow. With 5 Reagan and Bush Sr. appointments on the court, Leo and his colleagues believe they might finally be able to rule that Roe v. Wade was unconstitutional. But 3 conservative justices surprised the right and chose to stay with precedent. Only Scalia and Thomas, the Federalist Society loyalists, and Nixon appointee William Rehnquist dissented. Leo was pissed, royally pissed. But secretly, Bush Sr. and even some prominent Federalist Society members were happy. The pro-life religious right was a big part of the Republican base, but actually overturning Roe v. Wade was a risky gambit. Many Americans didn't want abortion rights taken away, and besides that, an election was coming up. Bill Clinton hit the campaign trail celebrating a woman's right to choose.
George Bush won't guarantee a woman's right to choose. I will.
And beat Bush Sr. with 32 states. During the Clinton years, the Federalist Society grew substantially. By the end of his presidency, they had 25,000 members, up from 5,000 in 1991. And most of its members weren't students now. They were practicing attorneys and part of Leo's lawyer division. And Moneybags Kid knew how to tap wealthy members for fundraising. By 2001, the Federalist Society had $3.5 million in revenue. The Federalist Society's Kenneth Starr and his team of FedSoc lackeys spent much of the Clinton years lobbying investigations at the president and seeing if any of them would stick. They couldn't get Clinton out of office, but they were ready when there was a chance to get a new Republican president in. It was November 2000, and it looked like Al Gore was about to take the presidency.
And the Bush campaign is now contesting the projected victory for Al Gore.
He had won the popular vote and seemed to have taken Florida by a few hundred votes. But as more ballots rolled in, Bush was taking the lead.
Bush is the president-elect of the United States. He has won the state of Florida, according to our projections.
Recount. They are saying recount.
On his legal team were several Federalist Society lawyers who were working to stop the recount in favor of Bush.
I'm thankful for America and thankful that we were able to resolve our electoral differences in a peaceful way.
The next election cycle, George W. Bush was running against John Kerry, the first Catholic nominee since JFK. Remember that Bush hadn't won the popular vote, and it's pretty questionable whether he actually won the presidency at all. To win this time, he'd need Catholics. Leo was brought on to do just that. White evangelical Christians were Bush's base, and Bush had pledged to be a pro-life president.
The United States of America is building a culture of life.
But pro-life Catholics didn't always vote Republican. Leo hired the right-wing PR firm Creative Response Concepts to media-train Federalist Society members to stump for Bush and talk up the importance of the courts. Bush's re-election, which this time did give him the popular vote, came down to his coalition of the faithful. With Bush in office, Leo became one of the four horsemen, the official advisors for Bush's judicial nominees. Leo's first pick was John Roberts, a devout Catholic who opposed abortion and had fought to roll back voting rights and school desegregation orders. Roberts' views were extreme, but he and other conservative nominees had learned something from the failed Bork confirmation. Bork had said the quiet part out loud, and Roberts knew that he needed to keep his radical views to himself.
Mr. Chairman, I come before the committee with no agenda. I have no platform, and I will remember that it's my job to call balls and strikes and not to pitch or bat.
Judge Roberts did a fine job today. He answered the questions presented to him as faithfully and objectively as he could without prejudging any issues.
A surprising number of Democrats bought the Roberts as umpire stick, and he was confirmed with 78 votes in favor. Leo's next nominee was Samuel Alito. Now, Alito was going to have a harder time getting nominated. The ACLU came out against his nomination, something they hadn't done since Bork. In the end, Alito was confirmed by a tight vote of 58 to 42. Leo returned to the nonpartisan Federalist Society to a sizable raise. He was promoted from director of the Lawyers Division to executive vice president.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to stand before 1,500 of the most little-known and elusive of that secret society or conspiracy we call the Federalist Society.
During the Obama years, Leo shifted his focus to fundraising for conservative causes, including the Tea Party group Liberty Central, headed by Clarence Thomas's wife, Jenny Thomas.
America's at risk, and I didn't know how far left President Obama and the leadership was going to take us. Washington is sick.
It became much easier for Leo to do his job after the movement scored another major victory. In 2010, with 4 Federalist Society associated judges on board, the court decided to hear a case brought before them by right-wing anti-abortion lawyer James Bopp, a case about limits on political donations.
The average voter could care less who's, quote, funding a politician or
Really?
Of course.
The Federalist Society, lovers of the good old days themselves, had wanted to get rid of campaign finance limits on corporations and political nonprofits for years. Here's Mitch McConnell talking at the Federalist Society in 1999.
Now remember, the $1,000 contribution limit was set back in 1974 at a time when a Mustang cost $2,700.
The case was called Citizens United, and it was decided with all 4 of the Federalist judges and the saving vote Kennedy in favor. After this ruling, there was an explosion of political nonprofits and PACs that didn't have to disclose their donors. With these dark money contributors, Leo and other donors were able to create a network of dozens of organizations to back conservative causes. You probably know the rest. In 2016, Antonin Scalia died while Obama was still in office, but the Republican-held Senate wouldn't let a nominee through.
Mr. President, the next justice could fundamentally alter the direction of the Supreme Court. So, of course, the American people should have a say in the court's direction.
When it was clear that Trump would be the Republican contender for president, Leo was ready with a list of names.
I came up with a list. The Federalist Society was very much involved.
Leo's nonprofit organizations distributed ads and were quoted over and over in newspapers. First, to block Merrick Garland, and then to endorse Neil Gorsuch. The Washington Post reported that 9 of the organizations hired the same conservative PR firm, Leo's ally from the Bush years, Creative Response Concepts.
President Trump wanted to talk to us about how important he views this election he's going to have to make in the coming months.
When Justice Kennedy retired, Leo launched the Freedom Opportunity Fund and gave $4 million to a group called the Independent Women's Voice, who went on Fox News and endorsed Brett Kavanaugh. In this segment, 3 speakers are all tied to Leo.
Hasn't he been investigated by the FBI?
The reality is these folks outmaneuvered us in ways that we are now only starting to realize. With Kavanaugh in court, the Federalist Society now held a 5-4 majority, and Amy Coney Barrett made it 6-3. If we zoom out, we can see that these judges have been in the history of Leo's conservative movement. When Federalist Society member Ken Starr tried to impeach Bill Clinton, a young Kavanaugh was also on his team. And what about that famous Supreme Court case that stopped the Florida recount and gave George W. Bush the presidency? It was won with help from Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett.
I don't think the justices care that it's Bush versus Gore, or if it were Gore versus Bush. What they care about is how to interpret the Constitution. What are the enduring values that are going to stand a generation from now?
Of the villains we've covered, this is one where the phrase vast right-wing conspiracy seems unavoidable. The ultra-conservative bloc in the Supreme Court could be in power until 2065, unless Congress packs the courts or institutes term limits. Leo has been working in the shadows to shape the courts using millions and now billions of dark money, and Americans have little ability to resist his influence. He may only now be getting the credit he deserves, but there has to be a limit on one man's power.